Good afternoon, all, and welcome back after a quick lunch break. We are ready to kickstart our next session, and I will invite our four speakers for the same. I have Mr. Shreenivas Rao, Managing Director, State Street. I have Miss Victoria, CISO and Data Protection Officer, Coosto. I'm Mr. Vinodh Kumar, Practice Partner from Wipro, and I have Mr. Rajesh Thapar, who's Senior Vice President, Axis Bank, who will be moderating this session. Please welcome all the speakers on the stage. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, all. I think let's get going right in time. The agenda for this particular session is more to discuss on microservices frameworks, how it has been absorbed in organizations, what are the benefits it has delivered, to what extent can we make use of it, what are the risks and challenges around it, and then we may conclude with some learnings on where it should be used, where it should not be used, and is it a hype and all. So I'm just giving a brief of what we would be discussing coming up in next 30-35 minutes, and then we will have draw out four questions. I have an esteemed panel here from varied set of industries, from financial sector, from services sector, and also what we see as how it is seen outside the Indian geography. I mean, we have Victoria from Netherlands probably addressing some of the concerns, what we may bring it up, or she has some views on how how fintech industry per se is using, or elsewhere how the finance teams can be using microservices. Why microservices? I mean, I'll just do a touch upon before I take it to this esteemed panel for the set of questions. Uh, there has been a lot of digital disruption, and without doubt, that's something which is absorbed pretty well, which is expected by the customers. Everything that the customer wants is now on their mobiles, on their apps, and the changes, the expectations of customer are just too much. With the traditional applications, which over the years evolved, sometimes it's not too easy to make changes into those applications, get it deployed, and all that stuff. So one clause which normally goes with microservices is about this AWS, wherein within seconds they deploy the code. I mean, how quickly can you do it? And in the typical cycle of about 20 years back, when many of you can think of an application, it used to go through the waterfall model of testing and validation and integration testing and all that stuff. So a typical project would take you at 3 to 4 months for doing that testing and going ahead and deploying it. So agility definitely is the expectation from the customers, from the industry at wide. So microservices does help there. It's a self-contained component. It interplays with a lot of stuff. It helps in creating a resilient applications. So a lot of benefits. Maybe I'll leave it to the speakers to really elaborate on many of that. One key benefit that this actually gave is the fintech industry. I mean, fintech is meant to be in the financial sector. The fintech is meant to be very agile. You tell them the requirements and they will come up with a solution. And they are flexible enough, and that's what makes their business model work. So this has actually, the microservices is something which is a shot in the arm for the fintech companies. Whatever they need to do, they can do it much easier, have the components in place and deliver it. While all the good things are there are risks, there are challenges, there are complexities. We need to consider, we need to balance both. And through our panel, we will discuss some of those as well. So before we really get into the security aspects of it, let me start with each one of these panelists and ask them, how is it that they have seen this microservices framework absorbed in their respective organizations, and the sort of benefits that they have seen in their respective organization? What are the business use cases? Maybe let's go with Victoria, you first, and then the rest of them.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here today. But I think you already addressed one very big main benefit, which is agility. And the big benefit of microservices is kind of decoupling, like this form a big application or this big monolith, and making everything so much more easier to process, especially from a developer's even point of view, the real engineers creating the things. It's one byte at a time. You can create this, you can gain actually the in-depth knowledge of just a few modules and work together, cross-function. So you can really go deep into like certain things specifically, which is a real benefit on its own, to really understand, what it does, why it works in a certain way. And you also no longer need to be, afraid of those unforeseen consequences if you change something here that at the end, something falls off or drops. And also because you kind of decouple things, you also have the freedom and opportunity to also use other, tools, programming languages, databases. You can really focus really on the function that you want to perform it, less on the tools, because once you already decided on something, it's hard to change. There is more flexibility in that. And well, this is one of the main reasons why we use it at my current organization. I also used to be involved at a crypto exchange as an architect and one of the lead developers. And we also really leveraged microservices really to highly decouple everything, to really limit the compromise of personal data and the wallets of the end users in that case. So yeah, I think that's the I think that covers it just high level.
Okay, thank you. Vinodh, maybe next you can go in and tell something.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, yourself in Victoria has certainly stated the decoupling part, like, breaking the monolith apps. To put things in perspective, so especially from a security side, right? So when we have to, like, perform a penetration testing, or when we actually do a static analysis or dynamic analysis, when we identify a particular vulnerability, the first thing the development team comes up and says, "Hey, no, I didn't touch that particular part of the code." It's really like this was developed few years back, someone else developed it, we don't actually touch that at all. So now the decoupling and like breaking the monolith apps, like give a great flexibility even for the security to how to fit in, so on and so forth. And primarily because of like the new ways of working, wherein like where as you spoke about agility, again, like automation is at the hype, and the digital transformation is on a way high rise. So it makes more sense to be like to decouple the applications. And also, if you see over the years, the technical debt of each and every organization have actually increased to a great extent. If you're going to be very nimble, that actually ensures it gives you a flexibility to move your piece of code to anywhere that you want to, because having that to reduce the technical debt, and in future you ensure the technical debt is reduced. So it makes actually more sense. It makes the perfect business case for microservices.
Excellent. Shreenivas,
Yeah, sure. So from our, I work at a custody bank, right? And bunch of things that we do is basically service a lot of our asset managers, and large institutional services, basically, right? So one of the areas there where we found the sweet spot of doing microservices was in the client onboarding aspect of it, right? The whole aspect of account opening, AML, KYC, different aspects of different rules across different geographies, right? Various clients, and the customization of things that we do with each of these clients, right? I think what happens there is the complexity and at scale, right? And that is exactly where you will see microservices come into play, right? If you have an application small enough, or a medium size enough, not really complex, do you really need to go ahead and use the microservices architecture for those cases, right? So what we've developed an algorithm, I would say, is when do you go with a microservices architecture, right? It's something like this, right? If you say, if you need to build like a large or a complex application rapidly now, and that is where our onboarding comes into play, right? As we change geographies, as new clients come on board, we need to get them on board quickly. So we need to be adapting to those things rapidly, be able to do a release much quicker, faster, right? Be nimble, reliably, and over a long period of time, right? So if you're developing a large and complex application, if you need to deliver it rapidly, frequently, reliably, right, then microservices architecture is the way to go, right? So we found our sweet spot there. Other thing I'd like to quickly mention, basically take a domain as well, right? Security aspect of it, right? Every organization have some aspects of what we call a security framework that they would have built in with reusable services that every application within that particular organization call, right? Now, that is again a very good candidate for doing microservices architecture, right, within the security realm itself, right? I think that is those are the two major things like I'd like to highlight in terms of how we have been going through that journey at State Street.
Excellent. So good points there. I mean, more of the pro side of what microservices brings in. Now let's get a little bit on how to's of it, and maybe Vinodh, my question to you is primarily around what sort of tools and technologies, processes, resources would be required for an organization. One, to definitely go ahead with microservices, but more importantly, ensuring a secure microservices implementation. So what those technologies tools would be, and how do you see this changing from traditional SDLC mechanism of the security controls that you used to ensure, like it's left shifts and all that stuff which comes with it. So how is that transition happening and is absorbed or is expected to happen over the coming years? So how do you see that?
Well, that's a fantastic question, right? So even before I touch that, so I just want to give you one of my personal example out here. 10 years back, I used to be a penetration tester, and we were measured, very differently. Per se, like, how many applications do I actually stop going into production? So after 10 years now, here we are, and for the last 5 years, we have been talking about how do I promote security of an application so that it goes live without any critical or high vulnerabilities, right? So this is a huge transformation, for me, and also, like, this is what we have actually seen in the industry now, because long, security testing especially has always been a cop outside the car. What that means is, we generally engage during our system testing phase, come in, run some tools, do some tests, and give a 40-page document to a developer and say, hey boys, go ahead, it's your problem, go ahead and fix it now. And but now the complete model is actually shifted in, and what we are actually looking at is a kind of a security guy is the cop inside the car. What that means is we actually travel along with the developers, probably having them to move away from just identifying the vulnerabilities to fixing the vulnerabilities. So this is the key transformation that we have actually seen, or we have been, like, promoting it all across or seeing in the industry. So this actually facilitates, like, number one, they don't the entire application team doesn't see the security team as a problem creators, rather than, like, we are kind of one among the team and going ahead and solving the problem for them. It's not that the developers don't want to, like, fix the code, but they have all the application owners have actually promised a big shot, a VP in the organization, who wants that particular feature to be released in a couple of weeks. Everyone are actually pressed for the time. So looking at it, like, when the decentralized way of operating of security testing is does not actually, like, scale well. What we actually see could actually scale well is around, we've been talking about, like, building security culture, training the developers. Half of it could actually work, but it may not actually work as well, considering the time considered what a development team could actually have. What we have seen actually working is, a security architect is kind of embedded within the new ways of working. For example, agile. So he works very closely with a scrum master, understanding what kind of features are actually getting in, and also, like, ensure that he is part of the feasibility study as well, so as to recommend what kind of security requirements have to get into that particular, epic. And then, like, slowly in the security stories, he's going to, like, tell you, like, what kind of security testing have to be done. Starts off with your security architecture. So it's not that, like, we just say shift left, but it is kind of practiced, as you actually embed the security architect within the team. And then finally we have the security analysts who very closely work with the, development teams, so as to not only just identify the vulnerabilities and give it to them, but also help them to, fix those vulnerabilities. So this is a kind of a transformation from a culture standpoint that we actually do it. Once you actually have people in the team, and when you have a rapport that's developed with the development team, the synergies between these two teams are, like, fantastic. They collaborate, and then, like, ensure the vulnerabilities are actually getting fixed. So this is from a organization culture standpoint. Again, tools, we all know, integration of tools is fairly very, very easy, right? So it's about how do we get those results into place, into a single place, and then you know uh, draw out that subjective information so as to prioritize your vulnerability remediation part. Like, what I'm trying to say is, in certain scenarios, you see, like in security testing, you do SAST, you do DAST, you do pen testing, you do vulnerability assessments. The source of vulnerabilities are huge. This is where your application security orchestration and correlation come in, which can give you a kind of a visibility into vulnerabilities, so as to spend your remediation efforts appropriately, so that it can actually help the organization to release the code without any critical or high vulnerability. And these are few things which I want to say. I'll probably have Vic or Srini to add a little bit more on it.
Great. Thanks, Vinodh. Any other points that team wants to add? We may be open, but if there is anything to add, otherwise I'll probably move to the next question.
Oh, I think I only need to add, because we decouple things, because things become smaller, indeed, it's so much more easy to integrate stuff, even like security, but also even for what we already kind of discussed, the whole agility, the whole deployment, it becomes so much more easier to integrate things because they're so small, and because it's like a bite-sized thing. We also kind of noticed that really changed also, our frequency of releasing stuff. First, it was like once in a week with lots of huge testing, and then we were all like relying on this rollback mechanism just in case, because you never know what change might have affected something else. And now it's just like multiple times in a day, we all very confidently can feel we can release something, just one small thing, even if that small thing somehow we have to roll back, it doesn't impact the rest of the application. And that already gives such sense of relief to actually everyone involved in the whole process.
That's one other thing that I'd like to add is, what happens is, with the microservices architecture in place, you need to look at security all through end to end, right? Secure by design. That means when you're coding, when you're designing, you build security in. You need to look at security in your delivery pipelines, right? Across the board, all of your SDLC tooling, right? You need to be sure about your security practices in the delivery pipelines. You need to be sure about your security in the container aspects of things, right? Whether that be your Kubernetes services vulnerabilities, container services vulnerabilities, all of those aspects. And then finally, you're looking at the time-based testing, right? How do you involve that in terms of your security practice, right? I think what happens with security is it is not a single point or a point in time practice that you need to create, or a discipline, right? It needs to go all the way from design to the point of deployment, right? And that increases the surface area of where you need to look at across the board.
Yeah, good points. Good points. I mean, so going forward, Shreenivas, the next question which comes to my mind is, with a lot of benefits that we see, and while we did discuss on how the organization are approaching that, but and it seems somewhere that this particular framework or this particular methodology is absolutely wonderful to achieve, and almost everything should work, or application whatever we have should transform, and then that makes it more scalable, reliable, and all the benefits that we just discussed. But may or may not be. I mean, that's where the next question to you would be: what, according to you, should be the criteria for organization? And you did touch upon in the initial comments, what should be the criteria which the organization should put in place for thinking and considering what application actually become a candidate for this? So that's one. And second is, what considerations that would be important if I think that this application should be moved from monolith to a microservice based architecture. What is the steps, what are the successful approach scenarios, rather than I keep iteratively learning and following? But say it has a lot of benefit, but you have to follow a structured path. So what, according to you, is a structured path the organization should follow?
Absolutely. I think there are two, as you rightly pointed out. I think microservices architecture, I mean, the aspect of the pros of it and adopting it are huge, right? But is it the right architecture for everything? I think that's a question that we need to pause and ask, right, as we are going through that journey. And there are certain considerations, one, the application itself, right? What is the problem that we are trying to solve? Whether that is a new application that we are building, or an existing application, or a legacy application that we are re-architecting today, is microservices the approach, architecture, the approach that we go with, right? That is from an application and a problem perspective. But then that is not the only perspective that we need to look at. We need to look at also, as an organization, are we ready to take on that journey of microservices architecture, right? So I'll quickly talk about 3 or 4 criteria that we should look at from an organizational readiness perspective. First thing that comes to my mind is, as you are going into the journey of microservices architecture, you need to define the boundaries of what these services do, right? We need to look at, okay, are we looking at the exact functionality for this particular 10 services? What are the boundaries of these services? How do we define that, right? A stepwise approach. One approach towards it is looking at your data models. How is your data management within the team, within your organization being done, right? So you figure out your data model, and then based on your data model, you draw the boundaries for each of these services, right? So what becomes a prerequisite is whether your data management function within your organization is ready to take up on this journey. It's a very important. If the data management function on your organization is not ready yet, right, that can slow down things drastically, because now you are figuring out where to draw the boundaries of these services. That's a very important point. The second thing is infrastructure, right? As we said, it is for complex applications and it's for scale, but delivering these complex applications rapidly, right? So the next team within your organization that needs to be ready for this is the infrastructure team, right? Do we have the right practices, DevOps practices? Do we have the aspects of codification across your delivery pipelines, infrastructure, all of that, right? Is that something that you're ready to really invest on? And is your DevOps practice really strong enough, right? That's a second criteria from an organizational perspective that you need to look at, right? So these are the 2 major criteria, I think, from an organizational readiness that we should think of. Coming to the application side of thing, right? Just as simple, you need to look at it from the complexity of the application and how long the application is going to serve your needs, right? If it's an application that is going to be built up over a period of time, so you are building the blocks, right, using the microservices architecture. If you are refactoring something like a legacy application, right, and you are anyway touching the application, look at the complexity and the size of the application to give you a guidance in terms of whether you need to really take it into a microservices architecture. Otherwise, you would be if the application is small enough, then you would be complicating your application deployment with that, right? So those are some of the guidelines, I would say, that should help us decide which way we are going, right? To the next question, I would say, in terms of a structured approach, the structured approach basically starts from the problem itself, right? So you look at the problem, you look at the data model behind that problem, and then you start dividing the functionality into smaller units, aligned to a particular data model, and that's how you define your boundaries for the microservices, and that becomes a start for your implementation, right? So that's how I would say, gives you a much better rate of success with your first migration.
Absolutely great. Thank you, Shreenivas. And parallelly, I see there are question answers that have started cropping up, and there's Rashmi. She has asked the question. He or she, I'm not sure, but it's pretty preemptive of the next question, which I had for Victoria. So her question, or Rashmi's question, is primarily around challenges around microservices security and how do we implement it. My question primarily to Victoria is what I want to know, Victoria, is microservices, are they inherently, because we have a lot of reusable components, sometimes it can goes into thousands of it. So these interplay of these components increases the attack surface, right? So it has to be handled well. It needs to be carefully orchestrated and all that stuff. So what according to you are the risks that needs to be addressed in, and when I say risk, it's more of cyber risks that needs to be addressed when somebody takes up this journey? What can be the mitigants? What should be the best practices that one should follow in taking this journey from a cyber perspective? That as a CISO, when something comes to you, what are the guidelines or the policy directives that you put in place to secure this microservices end to end?
Well, in that sense, we have to realize that microservices itself, they're not inherently secure. They're just tiny applications. That's just the way how we have to look at it. So, and they're often this false sense of security. Well, we just have this one big thing, we split it up. But just because, you split it up, as you already kind of mentioned, the attack surface, it kind of, increases in that sense. So we have to look at first of all the basic things that apply to regular application, all web application concerns, just like the OWASP top 10 refers to. So those are just the basic things that we first don't need to forget. But there are also kind of new risks that, comes with this. Srini already touched upon this a bit, but it can grow. And that makes it so much more harder to debug, to have an overview of your system, entirely. They're small components, but they still work together. Often there is no centralized logging anymore. When does one service call to another because it's so decoupled? What's the function really of each service? Getting and maintaining that overview, that is kind of hard. So we have to pay more attention to really coordinating, making really a great arrangements and rules on how we can exchange data, how we do that securely. If we are processing or chaining services, are each of the services going to store that data forever? Or is just passing it through? And when it passes it through, when there's this kind of acknowledgement, are we deleting the data? Which is especially relevant when you process personal data or other sensitive kind of data. It all still comes down to what are we actually trying to do and accomplish. Just splitting it up for the sake of splitting it up, or using any tool just for the sake of using the tool, that's never the way to go. So my main focus is still, what are we trying to achieve? What are our benefits? Why are we really splitting this up? Because in the end, we all know how to secure an application. We often choose not to do so because it costs time. And that is kind of the risk that is also being introduced if you go too overboard, making decoupling things in such a micro and nano way, then no one really wants to do that. So we also have to be very wary and not going too far, and trying to still stick some of the functionalities that are relevant enough together, so you don't get lost in this whole fragmentation of mini services that no one knows who owns it. We even get lost at times, like from who does this belong, or other risks are introduced, that because you have the freedom to create your own little application, that you might use some very exotic toolings or programming languages that maybe your other colleagues, from a development point of view, that they don't have the knowledge of. And if that person leaves, it's on a holiday, then you have suddenly issues with single point, of knowledge. There are so many different risks which can be, addressed with this. So we really have to take one step back, really trying to understand on a functional level, what are we trying to accomplish before we can even move on to the technical things. But regarding the security controls, well, they're the basic things. Authentication, especially for APIs, you are more looking to like JSON Web Tokens, OAuth. We shouldn't forget about still authentication, the authorization, avoiding, returning more data than actually you want to give back. Still the validating of inputs, even if it's one small trusted service, even if you only use it internally, it's not even publicly out-facing, you still have to validate it, because what happens if something does go wrong from the other service, especially if it's chained, you can't implicitly trust it. You still always have to verify. Rate limiting is also one of the things that you also still need to take a look at. It would be a shame if your service is affected by that, or it can't services other services. Very typical still thing for any web application. Sufficient logging, versioning. If you decide like, oh, let's upgrade this, But you also need to know, okay, but what happens if other services, and they definitely will, are using your service? How are you going to manage that part? You can't suddenly like deprecate it and everything breaks. So there's so many aspects that you want to take into consideration. But for me, it all comes down to still having a high level overview. Why are we doing this? Why are we creating this? How critical also is each service in the overall landscape? I think if you have an overview of that, it becomes fairly easy to know what kind of things you want to apply. It's still, it's still custom. It's still a custom assessment in that sense. You also, especially in the microservice environment, there might be, certain exceptions that you don't want to apply all the whole full security controls, because if you do that too much, you also get issues when it comes to performance. It's all still about balancing. There might be other creative ways to still address security with other compensating controls, but it really depends on your architecture.
Yeah, well said. So Rashmi, probably it addresses your questions on how you secure microservices and the challenges and the risk around it. Vinodh, maybe the next question too would be, see, all these are for its interoperability and platform independence. Containers are used for actual launching it out. So, okay, and very important is that you secure these containers as well. While individually microservice communication is protected through various mechanisms. So, what are those best practices which you feel are required for container security, and some of those, if from your experience, which you think are probably overlooked many a times, believing that something, because there is a lot interplay of a lot of integrated components which are overlooked during this entire cycle. So any like comments on that?
Absolutely. See, the coverage plays a major role in here. Even before we actually start off, integrating the security activities within a microservices. First, you should understand where are the microservices, how many microservices do we have, and have we all actually onboarded them. So coverage plays a major role even before giving a prescription for the security recommendations for a particular microservice. So here's where it is. Right? It starts off with all our. I mean, it's fairly very easy to talk about. We have image scanning, we have repo scanning, and once if it is once the applications goes live, so just ensure we have the runtime protection part. But however, getting all these into act is one of the key part. And also just ensure when there is a compliance drift that actually happens, do we have mechanisms to identify those compliance drifts. For example, you might actually define policies for a simple one. We have to probably pick this up is again from a password standpoint. So when you actually spin it up, you have a lot of service accounts coming in when you do an image scanning. So are we actually doing that particular compliance checks for those particular service accounts where it can highlight? And based on that, your guardrails comes into play. Whether do we have to really clear the build or have the promote the build to the next higher environment, or do we have to fail the build, so on and so forth. But typically the start point would be the maturity assessments for various business units. Because see, today within an organization you have various business units who are rapidly transforming into microservices and the next gen technologies. So the key thing here is not it's not a silver bullet for each and every business unit within the organization, because each and every business unit would be on a different maturity levels. And probably one business unit could be way advanced, and the other business unit is just adopting. So it's better to have a blueprint across the organization. For example, if you're going to have a AWS blueprints or Azure, so on and so forth, have your blueprints ready. So based on the blueprints is where you're going to draw out prescriptions for those different language stack that we're going to use in. And then ensure whether all these language stacks are evangelized within the organizations to those individual teams, so that you are able to promote that particular awareness to the development teams. And from there on, when you start measuring it, and from a application owner standpoint, and from a security standpoint, so you get that particular visibility of where the compliance drifts are, and you ensure you are able to look at the points of failure and then take some remediation activities on that. So prescribably, we have a lot of CSPM tools across, which plays a major role in this particular space. It's better to have look at some CSPM tools, so that can actually help you in order to measure the security within the containers. One is starting off with the prescriptions, evangelizing is adoption, and then finally measuring it. So these are the best practices that we have actually seen. So where we have have the organizations being transformed into this particular space.
Yeah, quite true. Quite true. Shreenivas, I mean, there are two hype cycles which I see interplay today. I mean, one is this hype cycle of microservices. While we see a lot of benefit, there are challenges. So whether it's hype cycle or not, time will tell. But yes, it is one of those cycles which have just taken a probably a tangential elevation. The other one is the ZTA, zero trust, right? So while inherently microservices is meant to be decoupled and they talk to each other on some trust of authentications and all that stuff, how do you see as a chief architect, how do you see this interplay between these two hype cycles, wherein you have a zero trust and you have a microservices to be embedded? What are those best practices? What are the controls which you feel should be taken care when you create such a legacy or such an environment in your own organization?
Yeah. So if you look at what zero trust basically architecture says, right? You're looking at applying security, both on the client and the server side, right? So by default, the API security becomes what I call the essential part of the cybersecurity program. Falls under the zero trust practices, right? Now, how do you look at it? If you're looking at it, API security from three aspects of it. You look at authentication, authorization, and then threat prevention, right? And those are the three areas that you need to look at for every single API, every single service that you're trying to build in, right? Authentication, authorization, and threat. The third one, authentication, authorization, everybody does it. I think the aspect of looking at it is how do you embed threat prevention into the APIs as well, right? I think that is one important consideration that we need to look at. Now, to understand also to how to apply zero trust to APIs, we also need to, I think, look at the various different categories, right? One are internal APIs, right? These are internally used within the organization, microservices, APIs, communication between various applications, or the service mesh, what we call, right? I think that is something that cannot be overlooked. Though these are all internal services, I think by default, authentication, authorization, threat prevention across the internal APIs. Then we have APIs with direct customers, like the B2B APIs. We work with our business partners, all for the B2B products and stuff like that. API web clients, API for mobile app clients, right? Now, these are the various categories that we should look at. And then how do we apply our authentication, authorization, and threat prevention across all of these categories, right? I think those are the guardrails or the guidelines that we need to follow, right? By default, these two architectures, I think, align really closely, right? But the enforcement of the zero trust on microservices needs to be done really diligently, right? So that is something that every architect, every security professional who is part of that microservices agile team building up those services need to put the needle on, right? I think that is important.
Yeah, good point. So anything, Victoria or Vinodh, you want to add? Primarily, this also is related to one of the questions which is up there on the chat. Again, from Rashmi, is on how are these microservices coupled? Why we always been calling decoupling, but these are coupled. These talk to each other. There are API integrations, and that's the backbone of the entire stuff. So anything, Victoria, you want to supplement on what Shreenivas was mentioning on API security, API controls, and what needs to be enforced in this microservices architecture?
Well, not much in here what you already, addressed. It's like, never trust, always verify. I mean, still decoupling, it doesn't mean you can implicitly trust. It's not how it works. So not much more to add than just really, you still have to make sure that your transactions, that they are still valid.
Sure. And Vinodh, maybe the last question before we open up for the Q&A, because we have about 2.5 minutes left. How do we measure the maturity of the zero trust security aspect? Say, as a chief information security officer, how do you measure that the effectiveness of your policies are there on ground? What sort of KPI, KRIs are there which you feel is something which can be measured to show whether we are improving or certain things need to be worked upon?
I think
Did I ask? Sorry, did I point it to Shreenivas? Sorry, I meant if Victoria or Vinodh. Yeah, Victoria is.
Oh,
Am I
sorry.
audible? Yeah.
Yeah, sir. I also thought this direction was more to Shreenivas. Well, we don't really have in that sense, how to call it, employed zero trust in combination with our microservices. So I think maybe Srini can best answer this.
Sure,
this
sure,
one.
sure, sure. No worries, that's fine.
So I think I'd like to talk about two things actually, right? I think the measure of I mean, we need to establish that success criteria in the organization. A couple of pointers to that is specifically, again, going back to our API security practices, right? Do we see API deep request inspection that is being done at that level, right, across board, right? Are we looking at data leakage preventions? Victoria was saying, don't give away more data than what was asked for, right? I think aspects of that data leakage prevention, inadvertent data discovery that is happening, right? Those are the aspects of things that as a cybersecurity program should look at as some of the measures for how mature your zero trust architecture is in place, right? Those are just pointers I'm talking about. I think there is a need to develop that whole I would say 12-point factor or whatever to come up with that success criteria, but I'm just pointing to a few criteria there.
Perfect. Vinodh, anything from your assessment so how do you measure that your clients are actually having at a particular level of maturity in this?
Indeed, yeah. See, what happens is when it comes to a zero trust implementation, we have form 5 layers. One is from the user standpoint. Then you have your perimeter standpoint. You have your data. Then you have your applications. Because see, most of the organizations have implemented a lot of security controls in terms of they would have got SIEM source, but still ransomware attack is actually kind of happening, and it's all the way around, right? So, but still we are we are not up to the mark to identify those anomalies. The reason typically is because traditional the security implementation what we've done is fantastic in monitoring the north south traffic that is from your firewalls until your apps. But the lateral movement is where there is a key challenge, right? So this is where the implementation level of zero trust should also be within the applications and the databases as well. So this can actually help the security professionals to understand if there are any anomalies. There you can actually have your incident response team coming into a major role, because the holy grail for in a ransomware attack is around either they try to exfiltrate the data, or they actually start encrypting the data by even mocking those users, so on and so forth. So these are various things, best practices that we have to put in. And as I said earlier, the compliance drifts are the key things that can have a kind of a good prevention mechanism to put a break fix on all of these exploiting these vulnerabilities. So the as long as we are able to identify those compliance drifts, define the policies with respect to the organizations, ensure you have mechanisms to identify the compliance drift to and fix it. And also from a prevention is where the runtime application self protection comes in, wherein you are able to identify those anomalies. Even though if there are compliance drifts, there are few cases, and the the hackers also use modern ways to come and try to get the data out. So you have a last piece of your puzzle to protect, to prevent to happening is that's where you are implementation of RASP also coming in. So, and everything coming into a zero trust network again, brings in a big wave of that.
Thanks, Vinodh. So for last, maybe we have 2.5 minutes, but we can go into the questions. I mean, there are a couple of questions, or not couple, there are plenty of questions that are there, and mostly from Rashmi. While Rashmi will try to collate a few of those, and one question which is a couple of times that's asked there is about the credentials. Say when we have these identities there, it may be private keys, it may be credentials of the database authorizations and all that. How is that preserved and protected is the question primarily, whether it is cryptographic keys or it may be any set of credentials that are there in place. So what is the advisable way of doing it?
So yeah, I can actually pick that one. So see, the prevention of private keys, either earlier we used to use the USB sticks, if you actually remember, age old solution called as Aladdin. They were the first one to bring in the secure tokens, where you actually store your private key on your secure token, and also you generally escrow your security tokens as well. So that is one best way to do it, because your certificate stores within the browser can always be kind of compromised. So the better thing is to start using the secure tokens, or even the biometric readers that can actually help you to preserve your private keys very, very safely.
Okay. The other question which I see up there again repeated out is the data isolation. I mean, while one or the other way that's cropped up. So how is the data isolation kept while it was touched upon by Victoria as well? So when the information is exchanged between, so how is that protected within the application or services boundaries? And how do we know if that data is getting exfiltrated and all that stuff? So what are the data isolation controls which typically are recommended in a microservices architecture? So that's the question. I mean, maybe Victoria or Shreenivas, either of you can.
No, you always want to monitor, your APIs. And I think that's very much, often overlooked, especially if you talk to like CISOs or other, more of the business people. We always talk about our assets. We always talk about our servers. We kind of always forget our APIs for some reason, if you just ask us on a high level. So monitoring, what goes in, what goes out, that is so critical to have those, the ability to detect any anomalies. When it comes, to data transfer, normally, microservices itself, it's not only the software that is kind of decoupled. Very, very, very often also its underlying database is also decoupled. So it kind of, belongs to that little microservice that you're building here. So when you kind of exchange data, there are various ways on how to, to do this. In my experience when, I was securing a cryptocurrency exchange, what we have done, for example, really on the onboarding of, people trying to register and create an account, they have to, prove their identity first before they can create an account. So they will send a copy of the passport, copy of their proof of residency. And those are things, very sensitive data. You don't want that to go out. But that is really on, an application publicly facing. How can you securely move this data, as an example, to another one? So what we have done there is, we make sure we encrypt the data, and we calculate a hash, and we send it, also encrypted in transit to another service. That service, for the, authentication validation of this being a real person, that service will acknowledge or will check, whether it received data. If so, it will send an acknowledgement, also will calculate its hash, send it back to the initial application, and that initial application sees like, oh, that other service acknowledged it, the hash is the same, so apparently it hasn't changed, while transferring the data. So now we can safely, in this case, remove the data which we have here. So then we only have the hash, and later on, when everything is validated, we can verify the identity. This is a real person. It will just say back, this hash, it's validated, with all the processing going on there. So this is just an example to get an idea of, how you can transfer the data. Once it's transferred, you can send an acknowledgement, and you can even, delete or remove the data where it comes from. But there are so many ways on doing so. But obviously, when you send data, always encrypt it in transit. And if it's very sensitive, encrypt it, itself. And, make sure that you have an overview of where you're storing data. And it comes back to the functional thing. What are we doing? What are we trying to achieve? What is this service? What's the value of having this service? Really understanding that part is critical.
Thanks, Victoria. Sorry to interrupt there, but I think we have already overshot time for a couple of minutes. So more questions primarily we can take offline, or we can respond back once we get it from the organizers, and then we can respond back. Thank you, everyone. I think it was an enlightening session for everyone here, and I believe that the guys on the other part of on the screen, the guys who are participating or listening to us, did make some meaningful sense of what microservices, how it is to be deployed, what security aspects are to be there. Thank you, my co-panelist, for this. And I should also thank Rashmi. I think one participant, probably she fired about 20, or he or she fired about 20 questions there on the chat. So which shows the interest and her interaction, what she wanted or he wanted to be in. Thank you so much. So lot to take away, guys. And with no more gyan beyond this. Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time, we'll close this session. If there are any more questions offline, or online, we can definitely come back to you folks. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. And we can close this particular session from here on. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you all. Yeah. Have a good day then.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.